The Helix Nebula burned with the light of 1,000 dying stars. And Admiral Seong Yura stood in silence as she had stood for 15 years. She wore the gray uniform of a human auxiliary. Stripped of rank and honor, her hands clasped behind her back in the posture of submission that the Valkyrie demanded from all conquered species. The observation deck of the command vessel, Eternal Dominion, stretched before her like a cathedral of war, its massive windows revealing the assembled fleet that had once crushed her world. High Commander Thezik moved past her without acknowledgement, his reptilian form casting a long shadow across the polished floor. His scales shimmered with the deep green of Valkyrie nobility, and his yellow eyes surveyed his domain with the cold satisfaction of absolute power. 12 battle groups, he announced to the visiting dignitaries who had come to witness his glory, each one capable of destroying a planet, and all of them mine to command. The dignitaries murmured their appreciation, their various alien forms shifting with admiration and envy. Yura remained motionless, her face betraying nothing of the storm that raged within her heart. She had learned long ago that survival meant silence, that dignity meant enduring without breaking, that hope meant waiting for a moment that might never come. Thezik gestured toward her with one clawed hand, and the dignitaries turned their attention to the human woman who stood like a statue among them. "This is Admiral Seong Yura," Thezik said, and his voice carried the weight of triumph. She commanded the human defense fleet during the fall of Earth, and she personally surrendered her forces to spare the civilian population from complete annihilation. One of the dignitaries, a tall insectoid creature with multifaceted eyes, clicked its mandibles in curiosity. "You keep her as a servant, High Commander?" "I keep her as a reminder," Thezik replied. "A reminder that even the most determined resistance crumbles before Valkyrie might. And a reminder that humans, for all their stubbornness, can be broken like any other species." Yura heard the words and felt nothing, because she had heard them 1,000 times before. She remembered the day she had made her choice, standing on the bridge of her flagship as Valkyrie weapons tore through her fleet like fire through paper. She remembered the communication from Thezik, offering terms that would spare 12 billion lives in exchange for her complete surrender. She remembered the faces of her crew as she gave the order to stand down, the mixture of relief and shame and gratitude that would haunt her dreams forever. And she remembered her daughter, 8 years old and waiting at home in Seoul, trusting that her mother would return. Yura had made her choice to save the children of Earth, and she had lost her own child in the process. 15 years had passed since that day, and she did not know if Minji was alive or dead. The Valkyrie had scattered humanity across the galaxy, sending them to labor camps and service colonies and mining operations where they worked until their bodies gave out. Yura had searched for information whenever she could, bribing guards and accessing terminals and listening to whispered conversations among the human servants who passed through the Eternal Dominion. She had found nothing, and that nothing had become a wound that never healed. Thezik dismissed the dignitaries with a wave of his hand, and they departed with bows and murmurs of respect. He turned to face Yura, his yellow eyes studying her with an expression she had never been able to read. "You performed adequately today," he said. "Your presence impressed our guests, and your silence was appropriately submissive." "I exist to serve the High Commander," Yura replied, and her voice was flat and empty. Thezik made a sound that might have been amusement or contempt. "You exist because I allow it," he said. "Never forget that your life is my property, just as your world is my territory, and your people are my workforce." He turned away and walked toward the exit, his guards falling into formation around him. "Return to your quarters," he commanded without looking back. "We depart for the Morvith campaign at dawn, and I want you rested and presentable." Yura bowed her head and waited until he was gone before she allowed herself to breathe. The observation deck was empty now. As she stood alone with the stars that had once belonged to her species, she made her way through the corridors of the Eternal Dominion, passing Velthari officers who ignored her and human servants who looked away. She had become a ghost among her own people, a symbol of surrender that reminded them of everything they had lost. Some hated her for giving up, and some pitied her for surviving. And none of them understood the weight she carried. Her quarters were a converted storage bay, barely large enough for a cot and a small table and the few possessions the Velthari allowed her to keep. She sealed the door behind her and sat on the edge of her cot, her hands trembling with the emotions she had suppressed throughout the day from beneath her thin mattress. She withdrew a small photograph, creased and faded from years of handling. The image showed a little girl with bright eyes and a gap-toothed smile, standing in a garden with cherry blossoms falling around her like pink snow. Minji had been so happy that day, so full of life and laughter and dreams of a future that would never come. Yura pressed the photograph to her chest and closed her eyes. And for a moment, she allowed herself to remember what it felt like to love without fear. She had given everything to save humanity, and humanity had survived. But she had lost the one person who made her life worth living. Thesic believed he had broken her. And perhaps he was right. She had no rank, no command, no freedom, no family, and no hope. She had nothing left except this photograph and the memories it contained. The alarms began to wail without warning, their shrieking tone cutting through the silence like a knife. Yura's eyes snapped open, and 15 years of suppressed instinct surged through her veins. She knew that sound, had heard it 1,000 times during the war, had responded to it with orders and tactics and the fierce determination of a commander who refused to accept defeat. The ship shuddered beneath her feet, and she heard the distant thunder of explosions rippling through the hull. She was on her feet and moving before she realized what she was doing, her body responding to the crisis while her mind raced to understand what was happening. The corridor outside her quarters was chaos, with Velthari crew members running in every direction and emergency lights casting everything in harsh red shadows. Another explosion rocked the ship, closer this time, and Yura grabbed the wall to keep her balance. A young Velthari officer stumbled past her, his scales pale with fear, and she caught his arm before he could fall. "What is happening?" she demanded. The officer stared at her with wide eyes, too frightened to remember that she was just a human servant. "The Morvith," he gasped. "They found us first, and their weapons are cutting through our shields like they are not even there." He pulled free from her grip and ran, leaving Yura alone in the corridor with the sound of destruction growing louder around her. She looked down at her hands and realized she was still holding the photograph of her daughter. For 15 years, she had believed she had nothing left to lose. But she understood now that she had been wrong. She was still alive, and as long as she was alive, there was still a chance. The ship screamed around her as the Morvith attack continued, and Admiral Seong Yura began to move toward the sound of battle. Mayan Colony Theta 7 was a wound carved into the surface of a barren moon, its processing facilities belching smoke into an atmosphere that humans could barely breathe. Yura stepped off the transport shuttle and felt the weight of the place settle into her bones. The despair and exhaustion that hung over the colony like a shroud. Thousands of humans worked here, extracting ore from the depths of the earth and processing it for shipment to Velthari worlds. They were slaves in everything but name. Their lives measured only in productivity quotas and survival rates. Yura walked through the colony with her heart pounding against her ribs, searching every face for the features she had memorized from a photograph taken 15 years ago. The guards had been ordered to let her pass. Thesic's authority extending even to this remote corner of the empire. She found Minji in one of the processing facilities, her hands raw and scarred from years of labor, her face hardened by suffering that no child should ever have known. The little girl with the gap-toothed Smile had become a young woman with eyes that held no innocence, no trust, and no hope. Yura stopped at the entrance to the facility. Unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything except stare at the daughter she had lost. Minji looked up from her work and saw the woman standing in the doorway, and her expression showed only confusion. "I do not know you," she said, and her voice was flat with the exhaustion of someone who had learned to expect nothing from the world. "You were 8 years old," Yura said, and the words came out broken and raw. "The day before the invasion, we took photographs in the garden, and cherry blossoms fell around us like pink snow." Minji's face changed, and something stirred behind her eyes. "You told me you would come back," she said slowly. "You promised you would come back, and I waited for you, and you never came." "I am here now," Yura said, and she stepped forward with her hands outstretched. "I searched for you every day. I never stopped hoping. I never stopped believing I would find you." Minji did not move to embrace her, and her expression shifted from confusion to anger. "You served them," she said, and her voice was sharp with accusation. "I heard the stories about the human admiral who surrendered her fleet and became a trophy for the Velthari commander, and I prayed it was not true. I surrendered to save 12 billion lives," Yura said. "I made an impossible choice, and I have lived with the weight of it every day since." "You surrendered to save strangers," Minji shot back, "and you lost me in the process." The words struck Yura like physical blows, and she felt the truth of them pierce her heart. She had saved humanity, but she had lost her daughter, and no amount of justification could erase that pain. "I am sorry," Yura said, and the words were inadequate, pathetic, meaningless in the face of 15 years of separation. "I do not know how to forgive you," Minji said. "I do not know if I can." They stood facing each other across a distance that felt impossible to bridge. Mother and daughter separated by war and loss and choices that had shaped them both in ways they were only beginning to understand. Yura did not try to close the gap, did not try to force a reconciliation that neither of them was ready for. "I will wait," she said simply, "however long it takes. I will wait." The transport arrived 2 days later to take them away from mining colony Theta 7. Minji had agreed to come, not out of forgiveness or love, but out of a pragmatic understanding that anywhere was better than this place. They sat across from each other in the passenger compartment, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. Yura did not push, did not demand, did not try to reclaim the relationship they had lost. She simply waited, giving her daughter the time and space she needed. The shuttle docked with a larger vessel for the journey to the outer reaches of Velthari space, and Yura was surprised to see Sub-Commander Drevon waiting for them in the hangar. His scales were flushed dark with hatred, and a squad of armed guards flanked him on either side. "Admiral Seong Yura," he said, and his voice dripped with satisfaction. "You are under arrest for treason against the Velthari Empire." Yura stepped in front of Minji, shielding her daughter with her body. "High Commander Thezek granted me passage," she said. "You have no authority to countermand his orders. The High Commander has been overruled by the Council," Drevon replied. "His judgment was compromised by his injuries, and his decision to release you has been declared invalid." He raised his weapon and aimed it at Yura's chest. "I have been waiting for this moment since the day you humiliated me on the bridge," he said. "And now justice will finally be served." The guards moved to surround them, and Yura felt Minji's hand grip her arm, whatever anger existed between them, whatever pain and resentment had built over 15 years. They were still mother and daughter. They would face this together. The hangar doors opened behind Drevon, and High Commander Thezek limped through them with a contingent of his personal guards. His wound had not fully healed, and he moved with difficulty, but his presence filled the hangar with an authority that silenced everyone. "Stand down." "Sub-Commander," he ordered. Dravan spun to face him, his scales paling with shock. High Commander, the Council has ruled. The Council can rule whatever they like from the comfort of their chambers on the homeworld. Thezik interrupted. But this is my ship, and my word is law here. He walked past Dravan without a glance, approaching Yura and Minji with slow, deliberate steps. I gave my word that you would be allowed to leave, he said to Yura, and I do not break my word. No matter what the Council demands, Dravan sputtered with outrage. This is treason against our own people, he shouted. You are protecting humans over Volturi interests. Thezik turned to face him, and his yellow eyes blazed with cold fire. I am protecting my honor, he said. Something you would not understand. He gestured to his guards, and they moved to escort Dravan and his squad out of the hangar. You will regret this, Dravan hissed as he was led away. The Council will not forget, and neither will I. Thezik watched him go, then turned back to Yura. The shuttle to the free settlement is ready, he said. You should leave before I change my mind. Yura looked at him, this being who had conquered her world and destroyed her life. And she saw something she had never expected to see. She saw a person who was beginning to question everything he had believed. Why? She asked, echoing the question he had asked her on the bridge. Thezik was silent for a long moment. Because you showed me that strength is not measured by what you take, he said finally. It is measured by what you choose not to take, even when you have the power to do so. He stepped back and gestured toward the waiting shuttle. Go, he said. Find the other scattered humans, rebuild what we destroyed, and prove that I was wrong about your species. Yura took Minji's hand and walked toward the shuttle, not looking back. As the vessel lifted off and carried them away from Volturi space, Minji finally spoke. Where will we go? She asked. Yura smiled, and it was the first genuine smile she had allowed herself in 15 years. We will find the others, she said. The scattered fragments of humanity spread across the galaxy, and we will bring them together. She squeezed her daughter's hand. We will rebuild, she continued. Not with weapons or conquest, but with the one thing the Volturi never understood. Minji looked at her, and for the first time, there was something other than anger in her eyes. What is that? She asked. Yura looked out at the stars that stretched before them, endless and full of possibility, the stubborn, irrational, unbreakable human capacity to love, she said. Even when everything has been taken from us, even when hope seems impossible, even when the universe itself seems determined to crush us. She turned to face her daughter, and her eyes held the fire that had carried her through 15 years of captivity. We choose to love anyway, she said, and that is something no one can ever take from us. The shuttle jumped to hyperspace, carrying them toward an uncertain future, but for the first time since the fall of Earth, Yura believed that future held something worth fighting for, not victory, not revenge, not the restoration of what had been lost, something better, a chance to begin again. 3 days had passed since the battle, and the Eternal Dominion limped through space with a third of its systems still offline. Repair crews worked around the clock to restore the vessel to operational status, and the whispers about what had happened on the bridge spread through the fleet like fire through dry grass. A human had taken command. A human had saved them all. The Volturi High Council demanded answers. Their fury transmitted across secure channels from the homeworld. How could a conquered servant have been allowed to issue orders on a Volturi warship? And what did this mean for the dominance of their species across the galaxy? Dravan fed their anger with carefully crafted reports, suggesting that Yura had planned the entire attack, that she had somehow coordinated with the Morvith to create a situation where she could seize power. The calls for her execution grew louder with each passing hour. Yura sat in her quarters and waited for the guards to come. She had known the consequences of her actions when she gave her first order on the bridge. had understood that saving the ship might cost her everything. But she had made her choice, just as she had made her choice 15 years ago, and she would not regret it. The door chimed, and she expected to see armed soldiers when it opened. Instead, a single Velthari aide stood in the corridor, his scales pale with nervousness. "The High Commander requests your presence in his private chambers," he said. Immediately, Yura followed him through the ship, past crew members who stopped there. Worked to stare at her with expressions she could not read. Some looked at her with something like respect, while others showed only the familiar contempt that humans had endured since the conquest. She did not care what they thought of her. She had not saved them for gratitude or recognition or redemption. She had saved them because letting them die would have meant becoming the monster that Thezek had tried to create. The High Commander's chambers were vast and filled with trophies from 100 conquered worlds. Weapons and artifacts and symbols of defeated civilizations lined the walls, each one a reminder of Velthari power, and among them, in a place of honor near the entrance, hung a tattered flag bearing the emblem of Earth's United Defense Force. Yura recognized it as the banner that had flown above her flagship on the day she surrendered. Thezek sat in a massive chair at the center of the room, his wound bandaged but still visible beneath the thin medical wrapping. He looked diminished somehow, smaller than the towering figure who had paraded her before dignitaries and reminded her of her defeat. "Leave us," he commanded, and the aide retreated. Sealing the door behind him, silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of 15 years. "The Council wants you dead," Thezek said finally. "Drevan has convinced them that you are a threat to our entire civilization, and they are not entirely wrong. Then why am I here instead of in an airlock?" Yura asked. Thezek made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sigh. "Because I find myself curious about something," he said. "You had every opportunity to let me die on that bridge, and no one would have blamed you for it." He leaned forward, and his yellow eyes searched her face for answers he did not understand. "I conquered your world," he continued. "I killed millions of your people, scattered the survivors across the galaxy, and kept you as a trophy to remind everyone of human weakness. And yet you saved my life." He paused, and his voice softened with something that might have been confusion or wonder. "Why?" Yura had known this question was coming, had prepared herself for it during the long hours of waiting. "Because I am not you," she said simply. Thezek's scales rippled with an emotion she could not identify. "Explain." "You took everything from me," Yura said, and her voice was steady despite the pain that lived in every word. "You took my world, my command, my freedom, and my family, but you could not take the choice of who I am." She stepped closer, meeting his gaze without fear. "I chose to be someone who saves lives instead of taking them," she continued. "I chose to be someone who helps the wounded instead of stepping over them. And I chose to be human even when you tried to make me something less." "That is weakness," Thezek said, but there was no conviction in his voice. "That is strength," Yura replied. "The strength that let humanity survive your conquest. The strength that will let us outlast your empire. And the strength that you will never understand, because you measure power only in destruction." Thezek was silent for a long time, his clawed hands gripping the arms of his chair. Then he reached for a control panel beside him and activated a holographic display. An image appeared in the air between them, showing personnel records and location data. "Your daughter," Thezek said. Xiang Minji, 23 years old, currently assigned to mining colony Theta 7 in the Outer Territories. Yura felt her heart stop, and the walls of the chamber seemed to close around her. "She has been there for 12 years. Thezek continued, "working in the processing facilities, surviving through determination and luck and the same stubborn resilience that I have seen in you." "You knew," Yura whispered, and the words tasted like ashes. "You knew where she was." "All this time, I have known since the day we separated you," Thezek admitted. "I kept the information as leverage, a tool to ensure your continued cooperation if you ever showed signs of resistance. His yellow eyes met hers, and she saw something she had never expected to see in a Velthri commander. She saw doubt. "I never used it," he said, "because I believed you had nothing left that I could threaten, and I see now that I was wrong." Yura's composure cracked, and 15 years of controlled grief flooded through her like a breaking dam. She had believed her daughter was dead, had mourned her in the silence of her converted storage bay, had kept the photograph as a memorial rather than a hope, and now she learned that Minji was alive, that she had been alive all along, that every day of her suffering had been a day. Her mother could have known the truth. Thezek watched her struggle to contain her emotions, and something shifted in his expression. "I am arranging transport to mining colony Theta 7, he said. "You will see your daughter again, and if she is willing, you will both be taken to a settlement where humans live in relative freedom." Yura looked at him through tears. She could not stop. "What do you want in return?" she asked. Thezek rose from his chair and walked to the window, gazing out at the stars that his people had conquered. "Nothing," he said. "I spent 15 years believing I understood humans, believing that I had broken you, believing that your species was weak because you surrendered to save lives. Instead of fighting to the death," he turned to face her, and his voice carried the weight of revelation. "But on that bridge, when I was dying and you had every reason to let me go, you showed me the truth." He raised one clawed hand and gestured toward the flag that hung on his wall. "I took your world, your fleet, and your pride," he said. "I thought I had taken everything from you, but I was wrong." He looked at Yura with eyes that held the first stirring of something that might have been understanding. "I could not take the thing that makes you human." The Eternal Dominion shuddered as another volley of Morvith weapons slammed into its failing shields, and Yura felt the deck plates buckle beneath her knees. She had stabilized Thezek's wound, but the battle was far from over, and the ship was dying around them. Drevin had frozen in the face of crisis, his ambition suddenly confronted with the reality of command, his orders contradicting themselves as the tactical situation deteriorated. The bridge crew looked to him for guidance and found only confusion, their discipline crumbling as fear took hold. Yura rose to her feet, and something in her posture made the Velthri officers pause. She had spent 15 years learning to be invisible, to suppress every instinct that had once made her a leader, to become the ghost that Thezek wanted her to be. But the woman who had commanded the defense of Earth was still alive inside her, waiting for a moment like this. "Damage report," she called out, her voice carrying the authority she had thought she would never use again. The bridge crew stared at her in shock, unable to process the transformation they were witnessing. "I gave you an order," Yura said, and her tone left no room for hesitation. A young officer responded automatically, reading from his console with trembling hands. "Hull breaches on decks 7 through 12. Shield generators at 18%. Primary weapons offline. Secondary weapons operating at reduced capacity." Yura nodded and moved toward the tactical display, her mind already calculating options and outcomes. "Helm, bring us about to heading 270 and increase speed to maximum," she commanded. "We present a smaller target profile and force them to adjust their attack vectors." The helmsman looked to Drevin for confirmation, and Yura did not give him time to countermand. "Now," she said, and the single word carried more weight than all of Drevin's shouted orders. The helmsman obeyed, and the Eternal Dominion began to turn. Drevin finally found his voice, his scales flushing dark with rage. "You have no authority here," he snarled, stepping toward her with his weapon raised. "You are a servant, a trophy, and I will not allow a human to command a Velthri vessel." "Then take command yourself," Yura replied without turning to face him. "Tell me your plan for surviving the next 3 minutes before the Morvith reposition for their final assault." Drevin opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He had studied tactics in academies and simulations, But he had never faced a real battle, never felt the cold grip of death closing around him, never been forced to think faster than his enemy. Yura had lived through hundreds of engagements during the war against the Velthari, and even in defeat she had learned lessons that no academy could teach weapons officer. She continued, "Target their lead vessel with everything we have left, and concentrate fire on their engine section. We cannot penetrate their shields with reduced weapons." The officer protested. "I am not trying to penetrate their shields," Yura said. "I am trying to force them to reinforce their forward defenses, which will weaken their sensor coverage on their flanks." She pointed to a cluster of asteroids visible on the display. "Communications. Signal our escort vessels to break formation and use those asteroids for cover. Then coordinate a simultaneous strike from multiple angles when the Morvath attention is focused on us." The communications officer looked at her with wide eyes. "That formation is not in any Velthari tactical manual. It is in the human tactical manual." Yura replied, "We called it the broken mirror, because we shattered our forces to reflect the enemy's fire back at them from every direction." A weak laugh came from the floor, and Fezzik raised his head to watch her work. "You used that tactic against us," he said, his voice strained with pain. "At the Battle of Jupiter's Moons, when your fleet was outnumbered 10-1, and we destroyed 37 of your ships before you adapted." Yura confirmed, "The Morvath have never faced this tactic, and they will not know how to respond." She turned to face the bridge crew, and her eyes blazed with the fire that 15 years of captivity had never extinguished. "I am giving you a chance to survive," she said. "You can follow my orders and live, or you can follow Sub-Commander Drevon and die. But you need to choose now." The silence stretched for an eternity, broken only by the sounds of destruction and the ragged breathing of the wounded. Then the weapons officer began entering targeting commands, and the helmsman adjusted their course, and the communications officer transmitted orders to the escort vessels. Drevon screamed in fury and raised his weapon to fire at Yura, but a clawed hand grabbed his arm and pulled it down. Fezzik had dragged himself into a sitting position against the command chair, his wound bleeding freely, his strength fading with every heartbeat. "Let her command," he ordered, and his voice carried enough authority to freeze Drevon in place. "I want to see if humans are as clever as they believe themselves to be." The Eternal Dominion completed its turn just as the Morvath launched their next assault. Yura watched the tactical display with calm focus, tracking the enemy movements and calculating their responses. "Fire," she commanded, and the ship's remaining weapons lashed out at the lead Morvath vessel. The enemy shields flared as they absorbed the attack, and just as Yura had predicted, the Morvath commander reinforced their forward defenses. "Now," she said, "signal the escorts." 6 Velthari warships burst from the asteroid field, their weapons blazing from angles the Morvath had not anticipated. The enemy formation scattered in confusion, their coordinated assault falling apart. As they tried to respond to threats from multiple directions, the Eternal Dominion's shields finally failed completely. But it no longer mattered. The Morvath were in disarray, their commander struggling to regain control, their momentum lost. "Reinforcements arriving," the communications officer announced, and his voice cracked with relief. 3 battle groups dropping out of hyperspace. Yura allowed herself to breathe as fresh Velthari ships appeared on the display, their weapons already firing at the retreating Morvath. The enemy commander made the only sensible choice and ordered a full withdrawal, their vessels vanishing into the darkness of space. The bridge fell silent as the reality of their survival settled over them. Velthari officers who had served under High Commander Fezzik for decades turned to look at the human woman who had saved them all. Some showed gratitude, some showed confusion, and some showed the same hatred that burned in Drevon's eyes. But all of them now knew what Yura had known for 15 years. They had conquered humanity, but they had never truly understood what that meant. Fezzik watched her from his position on the floor. His yellow eyes holding questions he did not know how to ask. Yura met his gaze and said nothing. Because there was nothing left to say, she had saved them because that was who she was. And no amount of conquest could change the truth she carried in her heart. The Eternal Dominion groaned like a wounded beast as Yura pushed through the smoke-filled corridors toward the bridge emergency bulkheads had sealed throughout the ship, forcing her to take detours through maintenance tunnels and service passages that the Valkyrie crew had forgotten existed. She had memorized every path during her 15 years of captivity, walking the halls in the dead of night when no one was watching. Learning the ship that had become her prison explosions continued to rock the vessel, each one closer than the last. And she could feel the vibrations in her bones as the Morvith weapons tore through hull plating that was supposed to be invincible. The Valkyrie had ruled this sector of space for centuries. Their technology so advanced that no species had ever challenged them successfully. But something had changed, and their shields were failing. And the pride of High Commander Fezzik was burning around him. Yura rounded a corner and found two young Valkyrie crew members trapped beneath a collapsed beam. Their scales torn and bleeding, their cries of pain echoing through the damaged corridor. They were barely more than children, probably fresh from the training academies, thrown into a battle they had never expected to face. She did not hesitate. Yura grabbed the beam and pulled with all her strength, her muscles screaming in protest, her feet sliding on the debris-covered floor. The beam shifted slightly, and one of the crew members managed to drag himself free. "Help me," Yura commanded, and the young Valkyrie obeyed without thinking, adding his strength to hers. Together, they lifted the beam enough for the second crew member to escape. And then they let it fall with a crash that shook the corridor. The two Valkyries stared at Yura with confusion in their yellow eyes, unable to understand why a human servant would risk her life to save them. "Medical bay is 3 sections aft," Yura said, pointing down the corridor. "Go now, before the next barrage hits." They ran without thanking her, and she did not expect them to. She was a conquered human, a trophy of war. And gratitude was not something the Valkyrie offered to their defeated enemies, but she had saved them anyway, because that was who she was, and no amount of suffering could change the core of her being. She continued toward the bridge, climbing through a damaged lift shaft and crawling through ventilation ducts that were filling with acrid smoke. Her lungs burned and her eyes watered, but she kept moving, driven by instincts that 15 years of submission had not destroyed. The bridge was in chaos when she finally arrived. Flames licked at the walls where electrical systems had overloaded, and sparks rained down from shattered conduits overhead. Valkyrie officers shouted orders that no one followed, their discipline crumbling in the face of an enemy they could not comprehend. And in the center of it all, High Commander Fezzik lay on the floor with a shard of metal protruding from his chest. Sub-Commander Dravan stood over him, his scales flushed with the dark red of barely contained ambition. "The High Commander is incapacitated," Dravan announced, and his voice rang with authority he had craved for years. "I am assuming command of the fleet." The officers turned to him with desperate hope, willing to follow anyone who promised to save them from destruction. Dravan surveyed the burning bridge with cold calculation, and his eyes fell upon the human servants who cowered in the corners. "Jettison all humans from the ship," he commanded. "They are dead weight during a crisis, and I will not have our resources wasted on conquered vermin." Guards moved to carry out the order, grabbing the terrified humans and dragging them toward the airlocks. Yura stepped forward, and her voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "That order will kill us all," she said. Dravan spun to face her, his yellow eyes blazing with hatred and surprise. "How dare you speak on my bridge?" he snarled. "You are nothing but a trophy, a reminder of human weakness, and you have no right to address a Valkyrie commander." "I am Admiral Seong Yura," she replied, And her voice did not waver. "I commanded fleets before you were born. And I know more about combat tactics than anyone on this ship." She pointed at the tactical display, which showed the Morvith vessels closing in for the kill. "The humans you want to jettison include your engineering specialists and damage control teams," she continued. "Remove them now, and you lose any chance of restoring shield function before the next wave hits." Draven raised his weapon, aiming it directly at her face. "One more word, and I will execute you myself." "Then execute me," Yura said, "and watch your ship die around you while you waste time on revenge." The bridge fell silent, except for the crackle of flames and the distant thunder of explosions. Draven's hand trembled with rage. But he did not fire, because some part of him knew she was right. A weak voice rose from the floor, and every head turned toward High Commander Thesic. "Let her speak," he rasped, blood bubbling at the corners of his mouth. "I want to hear what my trophy has to say." Yura knelt beside him, her eyes meeting his for the first time as something other than conqueror and conquered. She could see the life draining out of him, his scales growing pale, his breathing shallow and labored. She had dreamed of this moment for 15 years, had imagined watching him die and feeling satisfaction and justice and vindication. But she felt none of those things. She felt only the cold clarity of a commander facing an impossible choice. The same clarity that had guided her when she surrendered her fleet to save 12 billion lives. "The wound is survivable if I can stabilize it," she said. "But you need to trust me." Thesic laughed, and the sound turned into a wet cough that sprayed blood across the floor. "Trust a human," he whispered. "Trust the woman I conquered and humiliated and kept as a symbol of defeat for 15 years. "Yes," Yura said simply. She reached for the metal shard, and Draven shouted for her to stop, and the guards raised their weapons. And the bridge held its breath. Thesic raised one clawed hand, silencing them all. "Let her try," he said. "If she kills me, you can have your revenge, Draven. And if she saves me, then perhaps I will finally understand what makes humans so difficult to break." Yura did not hesitate. She tore strips from her uniform and used them to pack the wound around the shard, applying pressure to slow the bleeding while she worked. Her hands moved with the precision of training she had never forgotten, skills she had learned in military academies and perfected in the chaos of 100 battles. The bridge crew watched in stunned silence as a human servant fought to save the life of their High Commander. Draven stood frozen, his weapon still raised, his face twisted with emotions he could not name, and Thesic watched Yura with eyes that held something new, something that might have been curiosity or confusion or the first stirring of respect. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Yura did not answer. She simply continued to work, her hands steady and sure, refusing to let him die no matter how much he deserved it, because that was who she was, and they had never been able to take that away from her.